Hey everyone, we're going to talk about section 4.4 and it is all about congruent triangles. So we have talked about angles being congruent or segments being congruent. Now we're going to talk about congruent figures. Alright, so geometric figures are congruent if they are the same size and shape. Corresponding angles and corresponding sides are in the same position. Two polygons are congruent if and only if, so this is important, okay? So if and only if their corresponding angles and sides are congruent. In a congruence statement, the order of the vertices indicates the corresponding parts. So that's a lot of vocab right there, right? So take a look at this figure down here. Okay, we're given these two triangles and they're marked up and we're given this congruence statement down here. We are told that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. Okay, so when we look at this, first of all, we're given all the markings and we're given the congruence statement. So if I wanted to name the corresponding angles, it's just the ones that match. So you can either look at the figure, right? Look at angle A, it's got one mark. Angle D has one mark. So angle A is congruent to angle D. Those are corresponding angles. Okay. Then look at angle B. Angle B's got two marks. And angle E's got two marks. So those are congruent to each other. And then lastly, angle C is congruent to angle F. That should be something you've already done before, right? We have definitely pulled congruent parts before. Look at the order of your congruence statement. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. A, B, C, D, E, F. They go right in order, guys. All right. When we're looking at the corresponding sides, we can do the same thing. We can either look at the tick marks that are on the figure, or we can look at the order of our congruence statement. So when we look here, AB has one tick mark, DE has one tick mark. Notice that I did say DE, even though if we go from left to right, it does say ED. Either one would technically be fine, but we want to be careful about our order. So when we look here, AB and DE are the ones that match. That's because, look at A, it's got one arc mark, B's got two arc marks. So on my other triangle, I'm going to go from the angle that's got one arc mark to the angle that's got two arc marks, because then I can just make sure I'm going in the right order. All right, so AB to DE. Then we could say BC. All right, well, BC's got two tick marks on it. So the one over here that's got two tick marks, well, that's EF. So BC is congruent to EF. And then lastly, we would have AC. And AC would be congruent to DF. All right, so again, you can either do it from your congruence statement or you can do it from the marks that are on your triangle. Sometimes I only give you one or the other, so you do have to be able to do it from both, okay? Your learning targets are at the bottom. Please make sure you read through those and assess yourself and decide how you're doing so far, okay? Next thing we are going to talk about is the reflexive property. Okay, so the reflexive property tells us that any angle or segment is always congruent to itself. Okay, so anytime you have a segment or an angle, technically you can use reflexive property and say, hey, it's congruent to itself. The reason this is important is we are always going to look for a shared side or angle. Okay, I know some of you know that the direction we are headed is that we're going to start proving triangles congruent. In order to do that, we have to have certain sets of congruent statements, okay? So sometimes we might use reflexive property to get us there. So we always want to look for a shared side or a shared angle. Reflexive property, think about your reflection, okay, in a mirror. It's always exactly the same as you, right? When you look in the mirror, you see yourself back. That's a reflection. It means you're congruent to itself, right? So take a look at our pictures here. This first one, notice that the triangles are next to each other. All right, so technically there's 3 triangles in this picture. There's triangle BAC, there's triangle CAD, and there's triangle BAD, right? So we've got the 2 little ones and we've got the big one. Well, if we look at the 2 little ones, they both share side AC, okay? Anytime they are shared, it's reflexive property. It means that AC is congruent to AC. And the way that I can mark that in my diagram is I can either just put 1 tick mark, I could put 2 tick marks. Usually when it's a shared side like that, I like to put an X. Okay, because reflexive has an X in it. It reminds me that it's the reflexive property. So I usually put an X. You can put a normal tick mark if you want. Okay, then look at this second one. Okay, this figure is a little bit harder to see. We've got some overlapping triangles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to color one of them. So I'm going to say A, B, C is one triangle. Okay, so that orange one right there is one triangle. And then I'm going to say that this other one, so triangle DEB, so the blue one, those 2 triangles are overlapping each other, right? So we want to look and see, okay, well, what is it that they share? In this case, they actually share an angle, okay? So we can mark this angle right here. Doesn't matter what type of arc mark you put, okay? I just put 1 arc mark with 2 ticks on it. But what we're saying then is that angle B is congruent to angle B. We can use 1 letter or we could use 3. We're going to look at a different way to kind of break these up when you guys come to class. So I'm going to leave that for now. But hopefully you can see those 2 different triangles there. All right, this one should look familiar. Hopefully you all remember vertical angles, and we talked about them in class today. So vertical angles are always congruent to each other. That is what you need to know. Okay, we learned that all the way back in chapter 1. We've been doing that for a while now. So when we look at this picture here, remember vertical angles, we're looking for that bow tie shape. Okay, that always tells us that there's some vertical angles. So if we look here, my vertical angles are right here. So that would be angle HJI and angle KJL. They both have a vertex of J because that's where they meet, but you do need to use 3 letters there. That should be a review, so I'm moving on. Okay. All right, last theorem we got to talk about, right angles. Well, everybody knows that right angles mean that they're 90 degrees, right? Well, that means if I have a right angle over here, so if I'm saying angle A is a right angle, and I'm saying that angle X is a right angle, that means I can say angle A is congruent to angle X. They're both 90 degrees, right? That's the definition of congruence then, that they're both the same measure. So the theorem that you need to know here is that right angles are congruent. Seems a little redundant. I think you guys already know that conceptually, but it is a theorem that we're going to talk about. Okay? All right, moving on. So on here we want to identify the congruent corresponding parts and write a congruent statement for each pair of congruent triangles. So I'm telling you already that these 2 triangles are congruent to each other. I just want you to tell me what the congruent parts are and then write the congruence statement. So when we look here, let's identify the angles first. So I usually just start with the one that's got 1 arc mark. All right, so angle A is congruent to angle D, And then if I look for the one that's got another arc mark here, so how about angle B? And then over in this triangle, we've got angle E. And the last set would be angle C. That's got 2 arc marks, and angle F has 2 arc marks. Easy, right? Then look at your sides. Go with your 1 arc mark. So that would be AB is congruent to 1 arc mark over here. So that would be DE. 2 arc marks, how about that? Or 2 tick marks, excuse me. AC is congruent to DF. And the last set, they both have a circle on it, so those are showing me that those 2 segments are the same. So BC is congruent to EF. All right, make sure that all of your angles have the angle mark. Make sure that all of your sides have the segment bar above them, because we are talking about segments. Your order could be a little different. If you said BA, that's fine. If you said ED, that's fine. If you said angle D is congruent to angle A, that's fine. You just have to make sure that the corresponding parts are actually together. Okay? Then for our congruence statement, pick a triangle to start with and just pick an order. All right, so I'm going to pick this triangle. First thing I'm going to do, I have to write the triangle symbol. So triangle, I'm going to start with ABC because it goes in order, right? And I'm going to say that that is congruent to triangle. Now my order matters. Okay, I don't care what order you started with. You get to pick the order that you start. But once you pick it, you got to stick with it. So angle A, well, that was congruent to angle D, so that means D is going to have to come first. Angle B was congruent to E, so E has to come second. And then angle C was congruent to angle F. So now those are in the right order. If I started with, let's say, triangle CAB instead, then think about what that would mean. Find my new order for me. So I changed this to CAB. So I'm starting at C, going to A, going to B. Go over to your other triangle and do the same thing. You should get triangle FDE. Okay, so your triangles may come in a different order, but as long as your corresponding parts are matching, it doesn't matter. All right, now I'm giving you a congruence statement, and I'm asking you to give me the congruent angles and congruent sides. This is actually almost easier than looking at the picture, I think, because it just gives it to you all right in order. So triangle GEO is congruent to triangle MTY. And we want to name the congruent angles and congruent sides. Just list the angles in order. Angle G comes first in the first triangle, so angle M. Then angle E is congruent to angle T. Those are my middle ones. And last but not least, angle O and angle Y. Those are going to have to be congruent. All right, the sides get a little bit trickier, but it's not too bad. Look at the first 2 letters in your first triangle. It's GE. Okay, well that is going to be congruent to whatever the first 2 letters are on your second triangle, which in this case is MT. Then look at the last 2. EO is congruent to TY. Then this third one is the one that's a little bit harder, but it's still not that bad. Look at the first and last letter in your triangle. So in this case, my first letter is G, my last letter is O. So GO is my third side, and then in this one, MY would be my third side. Okay, that's it. You don't even have to draw the triangles again. You don't have to do any markings. You don't have to do anything. You literally just have to look at the congruence statement and tell me the congruent segments and angles. It's pretty easy. 2 more little things that we got to do. Identify the congruent corresponding parts of the triangles. We want to make sure we include vertical angles and reflexive property. So I'm hoping that you guys look at this and you immediately see that bow tie shape. All right, bow tie shape means that we've got vertical angles. So I'm going to go ahead and put some marks in to show my vertical angles. Notice that I did not just put 1 arc mark because angle V and angle Y already have 1 arc mark. If I only put 1 arc mark here and here, I'm saying that they're all congruent to each other, and that's not necessarily true. It could be, but it's not necessarily true. All right, so I want to name my congruent stuff here. Well, let's start with the easy stuff. Angle Y is congruent to angle V. That was already marked for me. And let's see, yx and vx are congruent. That was also marked for me. Vx and xy. Whoops, sorry. Okay, and then the last thing that's congruent are those vertical angles that we marked. So please make sure you name your vertical angles correctly. So let's start at y. So yxz is congruent to angle VXW. And that's all it is. All right, we were given these ones, they were already marked. We were given the segments, they were already marked. We just had to pull those vertical angles and get that they were congruent to each other. All right, then look at number 5, last one. All right, E is the midpoint of BD. So we need to take that information and we're going to have to mark the diagram. Okay, this is going to be so important going forward. So E is the midpoint of BD. I think the first thing I'm going to do then is I'm going to highlight what BD is, because I think this is one that students really struggle with sometimes. So there's BD. If E is the midpoint of that segment, you have to think about what that means. Midpoint means that I'm getting two congruent segments. Okay, which means since BD is the whole segment, BE and ED are going to have to be congruent to each other. Okay, I think highlighting that initial segment is going to help you because these can get a little tricky. Okay, then I want to look at AB is parallel to CD. Hopefully the review in class today helped refresh your memory about those parallel lines. So AB is right here, CD is right here. The way that we mark that is by putting those arrows. You could put one or you could put two, either one, it does not matter to me. And the very last thing that we're going to want to mark is that angle A is congruent to angle C. So angle A is right here. I'm going to put 2 arc marks. You could put 1 if you want. And that's congruent to angle C. So I got 2 arc marks there. And ooh, almost forgot one last thing. We've got that bow tie shape again, which means we've got vertical angles. So I'm going to go ahead and mark that in there as well. Those 2 angles are congruent to each other. So this one actually ends up with 4 markings, even though we were only given 3. Okay, because we have to pull those vertical angles in there. So hopefully that makes sense. I know the beginning part is super easy. This part I feel is going to be the part that we're going to need a little bit more practice on. So we will be doing that in class on Thursday and on Friday. So make sure you wrote down any questions that you have. We will talk about them when you guys get into class. I will see you later. Bye.